Imagine leaving everything behind for a peaceful life off the grid, only to discover that the wilderness you dreamed of is hiding a dark, terrifying secret. In tonight's chilling tale, we follow a couple who thought they were escaping the noise of city life, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmarish reality. As they venture deeper into the isolated forests of Colorado, strange and eerie events begin to unfold. From mysterious footprints to unsettling noises in the night, the forest seems to be alive, watching their every move. Will they escape the terror lurking in the shadows, or will the wilderness claim them too? Tune in for a spine-chilling journey into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark and hit the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying tale. Join us as we unravel the mysteries hidden in the shadows, if you dare. Imagine leaving everything behind for a peaceful life off the grid, only to discover that the wilderness you dreamed of is hiding a dark, terrifying secret. In tonight's chilling tale, we follow a couple who thought they were escaping the noise of city life, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmarish reality. As they venture deeper into the isolated forests of Colorado, strange and eerie events begin to unfold. From mysterious footprints to unsettling noises in the night, the forest seems to be alive, watching their every move. Will they escape the terror lurking in the shadows, or will the wilderness claim them too? Tune in for a spine-chilling journey into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark and hit the notification bell so you never miss a terrifying tale. Join us as we unravel the mysteries hidden in the shadows, if you dare. Part 1. The Haunted Cabin in the Mountains. For years, I dreamt of escaping the city, where the noise never stopped and the air was thick with the hustle of everyday life. My wife, Emma, and I had always shared that dream, a dream of a life away from the chaos. We talked endlessly about building a cabin, living off the land, and finding peace in the quiet embrace of nature. So, when we stumbled upon a secluded plot of land deep in the mountains of Colorado, we felt as if it were fate. It seemed perfect, a patch of wilderness untouched by the hands of man, miles away from any neighbors, nestled in a forest surrounded by towering pines and rocky ridges. The land was cheap, the price almost too good to be true. A realtor had warned us, of course. The plot was in the middle of nowhere, about 2 hours from the nearest town, accessible only by an old dirt road that disappeared into the thick woods. He said most people wouldn't last a week out there. But we were undeterred. We were determined to make it work. So we sold most of our things, bought an old RV, and headed to the mountains with our dog Max, a golden retriever who was always up for an adventure. We were ready for the change. The cabin we planned to build would be simple, a place to escape, a place to breathe freely again. The first few days felt like something out of a dream. The air was fresh, the mornings quiet, with only the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves to greet us. Max darted through the woods, chasing squirrels and sniffing at the endless trails the forest offered. The sun set over the ridge, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. I could hardly believe our luck, but it wasn't long before I started to feel a shift. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but there was an underlying tension in the air that I couldn't shake. Every time I stepped outside the RV, it felt as though the trees were watching me, silent, still, but always present. The forest was too quiet, too still. During the day, everything seemed normal, but as night fell, the world around us transformed. The silence at night was oppressive. It wasn't like the quiet of a suburban home where the sounds of distant traffic still hummed. No, this silence was different. It was thick, suffocating. When we tried to sleep, the silence would press down on me, my thoughts a constant buzz in my head, filled with an unshakable unease. I'd hear things in the night, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. But when I opened the window or looked out into the darkness, I saw nothing. At first I told myself it was just wildlife, deer, or the occasional bear. But the feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Emma felt it too. "Do you hear that?" She'd ask in the dead of night, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd shake my head, not wanting to admit that, yes, I did hear it. We were just too far from civilization, too far from any comforts we'd known, and that isolation was starting to get under my skin. A week into our stay, things started to get strange. It began with Max's behavior. At night, he would growl low in his throat, staring out the window with his hackles raised, eyes fixed on something in the distance. The first time it happened, I brushed it off, thinking he'd heard something outside, an animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote. But the next night it happened again, more intensely. Emma's eyes widened with concern. "What's he looking at?" she whispered, gripping my arm. "I don't know," I muttered, trying to calm her. "It's probably just a deer or something." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. The following day, we noticed something unsettling. Max's water bowl had been knocked over. The ground around it was muddy, and the marks in the dirt looked like large footprints, too large to be ours or Max's. They circled the RV before disappearing into the woods. I crouched down, staring at the strange prints, my stomach tightening. I knew I'd been the last to fill Max's water bowl the night before, and I knew I hadn't knocked it over. But how had someone, or something, gotten so close to the RV without us hearing it? I tried to reassure Emma, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Maybe it was just someone passing by," I suggested. "Maybe Tom came by, our neighbor. He's a little odd, but he's been here longer than we have." Emma nodded, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. I wasn't either. The footprints were too distinct, too deliberate. That night we kept Max inside. I locked the RV door, something I hadn't thought to do before. Emma was still uneasy, but I reassured her, telling her that we were overthinking it. I made sure the locks were in place, but as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest, once a place of beauty, now felt like a prison. And whatever was out there, whatever had been watching us, was still close. Around 2 a.m. it started, a slow, deliberate tapping against the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the trees just beyond the clearing, moving from one side of the RV to the other. I froze, my blood running cold. Max growled deep in his throat, his body rigid. Emma's eyes darted to me, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a breath. I reached for the flashlight, shining it out the window. The beam cut through the dark, but it revealed nothing, just trees, dark shadows swaying in the wind. I grabbed the kitchen knife I'd kept nearby, trying to steady my shaking hands. The tapping continued, moving closer. Then came the scraping. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a slow, rhythmic dragging sound, like something large was moving along the side of the RV. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. Emma's voice trembled as she whispered, "Should we call the police?" I shook my head, even though I was just as terrified as she was. "There's no signal out here. We're on our own." We sat in silence, waiting. The sounds continued for what felt like hours, but when daylight finally broke through the trees, the sound ceased. I opened the door, my hand trembling as I stepped outside. The air was still, the morning light brightening the clearing. But there were no signs of what had been out there, nothing to explain the sounds we'd heard the night before. Max was acting strange. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods, his ears flat against his head. I followed his gaze, but all I saw was the forest, dark and silent. I turned to Emma, who was standing behind me, her face a ghostly shade. "We're leaving," she said quietly. Her voice was firm, but there was fear in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. "I don't feel safe here anymore." And just like that, the dream of our peaceful life in the mountains, the life we'd worked so hard to build, began to unravel. Part 2. The Uneasy Beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast expanse of the Colorado wilderness, Matt and Jessica felt the weight of the forest pressing in on them. They had been in their new off-grid home for a little over a week, but the excitement they had initially felt for this quiet life was starting to fade, replaced by an unshakable sense of unease. The cabin they had built, surrounded by towering pines and rolling hills, was supposed to be their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the pressures of city living and reconnect with nature. But something wasn't right. The forest, despite its beauty, felt unnervingly silent at times, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The first few days had been filled with the usual bustle of moving in, setting up the wood stove, organizing their small kitchen, and unpacking the few belongings they had brought with them. But as they began to settle into their new life, the isolation of their location began to sink in. The nearest neighbor, an old hermit named Caleb, lived a few miles away, and they had only met him once, when he brought over a jar of homemade jam and warned them about the quiet. He said it was too peaceful out here, that the silence could drive a person mad. At the time, Matt had laughed it off. He thought it was just the ramblings of an eccentric old man. But now, as Jessica chopped wood and Matt worked on the garden, the silence began to gnaw at them. It wasn't natural. During the day, they could hear the occasional bird call or the wind rustling the leaves, but by nightfall, the forest seemed to hold its breath, leaving them with nothing but the sound of their own heartbeat and the crackling of the fire. There was something haunting about that silence, something that made them both uneasy. One evening, after finishing dinner and sitting down by the fire, Jessica mentioned that she had heard something in the woods the previous night. She described hearing a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the trees. Matt had brushed it off as nothing, perhaps an animal or a branch swaying in the wind. But now, as he looked at her, he could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't the type to be easily spooked, but something about the way she spoke made him hesitate. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the pines. The trees outside groaned as they swayed under the pressure of the storm, and the sound of the wind pressing against the cabin felt almost deliberate. It was a noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the forest. As Matt lay in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, he heard it again, soft at first, like the distant sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush. He thought it was just the wind, but then the noise grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was circling their cabin. He lay still, holding his breath, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But the sound kept coming, steady and deliberate, as if whoever was out there was waiting for the right moment to strike. His heart pounded in his chest, and he squeezed his eyes shut, hoping the noise would stop. But it didn't. By the time he opened his eyes again, it was nearly dawn. The forest was still. The noises had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. Matt didn't say anything to Jessica about what he had heard. He didn't want to scare her, and deep down, he didn't want to admit that he was feeling just as nervous. But the unease was growing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to slip up. The next day, Matt decided to take a walk along the edge of the forest, hoping to clear his mind. He wandered through the trees, trying to focus on the simple beauty of the place, the way the sun filtered through the branches and the earthy scent of the forest floor. But even as he tried to relax, a growing sense of dread crept over him. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush seemed to make him jump. It was as if the forest itself was alive, a presence lurking just beyond his line of sight. He eventually reached the creek that ran through the property, where he stopped to drink from the cool water. As he knelt down, he noticed something strange. The ground around the creek was disturbed, as if something large had passed through recently. There were footprints, big heavy prints that seemed to encircle the area. Matt's stomach tightened. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were too wide, too deliberate, and there were no signs of any animals nearby. His heart began to race, and he quickly turned back toward the cabin. Something was off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As he made his way back, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if someone was following him, though he saw no one. The silence of the forest had returned, but this time it was even more oppressive. When he got back to the cabin, Jessica was waiting inside, her face pale. She had been in the garden when he left, but now she was standing by the window, staring out into the woods. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with a strange, worried expression. When Matt asked her what was wrong, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed out the window. There, in the clearing just beyond the trees, was a figure, a tall, thin figure that seemed to be watching them. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in shadow, but Matt could see the outline of it clearly enough. It was standing completely still, just watching them. The sight made his blood run cold. It was like the figure was waiting for something, watching them with an unsettling intensity. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, fading into the shadows of the trees. Matt turned to Jessica, his mouth dry. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," she replied, her voice shaky. "I don't know who it was, but I don't think we're alone out here." That night, they locked every door, every window, and set up the small security system they had purchased. Rusty, their dog, paced nervously around the cabin, his hackles raised. The tapping noise returned again, but this time it sounded even closer than before. It was as if the forest was closing in on them. Suddenly they heard a loud bang, a thud like something heavy had been thrown against the cabin. It shook the walls and sent both of them jumping to their feet. Matt grabbed the flashlight, his hands trembling. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but whatever it was definitely not something he wanted to face. He slowly approached the door, shining the flashlight outside. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. The forest was silent once again. "What the hell was that?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matt didn't have an answer. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure: they weren't alone. Part 3. The deepening dread. The next day felt like an eternity. Despite the sunlight streaming through the trees, Matt and Jessica couldn't shake the oppressive weight that seemed to hang in the air. It was as if the very forest itself had turned against them, its once peaceful hum now a constant, unsettling presence. After the previous night's incident, they spent the day double-checking every lock, securing their cabin in every possible way. The banging against the walls had shaken them both, leaving them on edge. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the cabin made their hearts race. But it wasn't just the noise from the night before, it was the sense of being watched, a feeling that never seemed to leave them, even in the daylight. They tried to stay occupied. Matt worked on fixing a few things around the cabin, while Jessica tended to their small vegetable garden, her hands trembling as she planted seeds into the rich earth. But neither could ignore the growing unease gnawing at them. As dusk began to settle over the trees, the woods grew darker. The wind shifted, bringing a chill that settled in their bones. The once comforting sounds of the forest now seemed unnaturally loud. The rustle of leaves, the call of a distant owl, the snapping of twigs underfoot. It was as if everything in the forest had become more acute, more intentional, like it was waiting for something. By nightfall, the silence had returned, but this time it felt heavier, more suffocating. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, as though it too was waiting for something. Rusty, their dog, was the first to react. He sat up abruptly, growling low and deep in his throat, his fur standing on end. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on the darkened trees just outside the cabin. "What is it, boy?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible as she moved to the window. Matt followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. They peered into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the twisting shapes of trees, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers in the night. But as Matt scanned the darkness, a flash of movement caught his eye. It was quick, too fast to identify, but it was there, a figure, a shape darting between the trees. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if it was real or just his mind playing tricks on him, but the shadow was unmistakable. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Jessica nodded, her breath shallow. "Yes, I saw it." Rusty's growl intensified, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the cabin. He leapt to his feet, pacing the floor in agitation. Without thinking, Matt grabbed the flashlight, his hands slick with sweat. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but he couldn't stand the feeling of helplessness, of not knowing what was out there. He opened the door cautiously, the cold air biting at his skin. The light from the flashlight cut through the trees, illuminating the clearing in front of the cabin. But there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the endless stretch of trees and shadows. Rusty barked, his tail tucked low between his legs, his body trembling as if he knew something they didn't. Jessica stepped outside cautiously, holding her breath as she stood next to Matt. "I don't think we're alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but Matt could hear the fear in her tone. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees, shaking the branches, and sending a cold chill through the air. Matt shone the light into the woods again, but it didn't help. The darkness felt alive, oppressive, as though it were pressing in on them. They were no longer in control of their surroundings. The forest had claimed them. The hours dragged on, the strange unease creeping into every corner of the cabin. As they sat together, huddled in the living room, the tapping began again. It was faint at first, barely audible above the howling wind. But as it grew louder, it became undeniable. Someone was knocking on the walls of the cabin, soft at first, then growing in intensity. Tap, tap, tap. Jessica jumped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stifled a gasp. "That's it," she said, her voice shaky. "It's the same noise from last night." Matt felt his pulse quicken as he stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. He grabbed the flashlight and moved to the door, his hand frozen on the doorknob. He hesitated for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the tapping. It was coming from the side of the cabin this time, just beneath the window. "Don't open it," Jessica begged, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, Matt, don't." But he couldn't stop himself. His curiosity, his fear, it all drove him forward. Slowly he turned the knob, opening the door just enough to peek outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the dense forest but nothing else. The tapping stopped immediately. Matt's heart sank. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise itself. He stepped out into the night, the chill of the air biting at his skin. His breath came in short gasps as he moved around the cabin, scanning every corner of the clearing. The flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the woods, the darkness pressing in around him like a living entity. And then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering from the depths of the trees. "You're not welcome here." Matt froze. The voice sent a cold shiver down his spine. His mind raced. Was it Caleb the hermit playing a cruel joke? Or was it something else? Before he could react, the ground beneath him shifted, and a shadow lunged from the trees, grabbing him by the arm. He gasped, struggling to break free, but the grip was too strong. His flashlight dropped to the ground, rolling across the dirt as the darkness closed in on him. He couldn't see who or what was holding him. The grip tightened, pulling him into the woods. The sound of footsteps echoed around him, too many to count. His mind raced as he tried to break free, but the force that gripped him was relentless. Through the haze of panic and fear, Matt heard Jessica scream his name, but it was too late. The forest had claimed him, pulling him into the void, and in the darkness all he could hear was the tapping. Part 4. The haunting silence. Matt's head spun. His body was jerked through the forest, each step a blur as the unseen force dragged him deeper into the shadows. The cold night air cut through his clothes, the forest closing in around him like a suffocating trap. He struggled, his legs heavy and his mind racing, but every attempt to break free only tightened the grip around his arm. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, only the frantic thud of his heart. Through the darkness, he could hear the rustling of branches, the snap of twigs underfoot, but there were no footsteps. Only the eerie sound of something or someone moving swiftly through the forest. He wasn't alone. The cold, tight grip loosened just enough for him to gather some strength. His fingers tingled, and he pushed himself to his feet, his knees buckling beneath him as he struggled to stand. He looked around, but all he saw were the towering trees, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands, blocking out the sky above. Matt's mind was racing. What was this? What was pulling him into the woods? And where was Jessica? His chest tightened as he realized he was utterly alone, surrounded by an unearthly silence that seemed to swallow any sound he made. And then he saw it. A shadow moved across the clearing, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's weak beam. It was a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still. Its silhouette stood out against the backdrop of trees like a specter waiting for him to make a move. Matt's breath caught in his throat. He knew he wasn't imagining it. This thing was real. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching him with eyes that gleamed like dark pools in the night. Matt's pulse raced and his legs buckled again. He couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, as if the very air around him was too thick to breathe. Matt. The voice, low and rasping, whispered through the trees. He recognized it immediately. It was Jessica's voice, but it didn't sound right. It wasn't full of fear or panic like before. It was distant, as if she were far away. He turned, trying to find her, but all he saw was the same empty, dark forest. Matt. Come to me. The voice called again, this time closer, almost as though it was in his ear. He spun around, his flashlight beam catching the shadow once more, but now it was moving. It was moving fast, gliding through the trees, almost floating. Matt staggered backward, heart hammering in his chest. Jessica, he called out, his voice barely audible in the night, but there was no response. Only the faint, unnerving rustle of leaves in the breeze. Without thinking, Matt began running, his body moving on instinct. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees leaning in like dark, oppressive giants. The sound of his footsteps was drowned out by the thumping of his heart, each beat seeming to echo in his skull. His eyes darted around, scanning the darkness for any sign of Jessica, but all he could see were the trees, twisted, gnarled, and suffocating. The path ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the underbrush thick with vines and branches that scraped at his skin. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as he pushed forward, desperate to escape whatever had taken hold of him. But the forest had other plans. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, sending him sprawling onto the ground. His flashlight flew from his hand, spinning into the blackness. He struggled to get up, his body heavy and exhausted, but when he did, something was different. The air was colder. The silence had deepened, and in the distance he could hear the tapping again, the same rhythmic knocking he had heard before. It was coming from all around him now, like 1,000 fingers tapping on wood, slowly closing in on him. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the darkness, so close that Matt barely had time to react. He froze, unable to move. The figure was no longer just a shadow. It had shape. Its features were dark, indistinct, but it was humanoid in form. Tall, with elongated limbs and eyes that gleamed like black voids, watching him with a cold, detached hunger. Before Matt could make a sound, the figure stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of existence. With every step it took, the tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if it were feeding on his fear. The world around him seemed to distort, the trees bending inward, the ground shifting beneath his feet. And then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving Matt standing in the middle of the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping had stopped. The silence was deafening once more. Matt didn't know how much time had passed. His mind was swimming with confusion and dread. He couldn't understand what had just happened. Was it a hallucination? Was he losing his grip on reality? But deep down, he knew it was. The forest had become something else, something alive, something that could sense him, track him, and toy with him. It wasn't just a place anymore. It had become a living nightmare. Matt. The voice again, this time clearer. Jessica's voice, but this time it was coming from behind him. He turned, heart racing, and there she was. Jessica stood just a few feet away, her eyes wide, her face pale and gaunt, as though she had been staring into the darkness for too long. She didn't speak, only stared at him, her expression empty, as if she were lost in some deep trance. "Jessica," Matt whispered, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. "Jessica, what's happening?" Matt reached out, his hands shaking as he touched her arm. She didn't react, didn't flinch. It was as though she wasn't even there, her body stiff and unmoving, her eyes fixed on some faraway point. And then, without warning, her head snapped up, her eyes locking onto his. The darkness behind her seemed to deepen, and for a split second Matt could see something behind her, something crawling in the shadows. A figure, tall and twisted, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles, moving just out of sight. Matt recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. "No, Jessica, run!" But it was too late. The moment Matt tried to move, the ground beneath him shifted again. He stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the wet earth as he fell to his knees. The figure behind Jessica lurched forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. And then everything went black. Part 5. The nightmare deepens. Matt's eyes shot open, his body jerking upright. His heart was pounding, his breath ragged as though he had just surfaced from deep underwater. The forest around him was eerily still, but he knew he couldn't trust the silence. The very air felt charged, as though it was waiting for something, waiting for him. He was no longer in the clearing. In an instant, he realized he was back in the woods, his body curled on the damp forest floor. His mind struggled to piece together what had happened. Was it a dream? Was it real? The last thing he remembered was seeing Jessica, her eyes empty, staring into the abyss. And then that thing, the twisted figure that seemed to crawl through the darkness. Shaking, he pushed himself to his feet. The forest was alive with sounds, but not the ones he had heard before, the usual rustling of leaves and chirping of insects. Now there was a low hum, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It pulsed in his chest, making his skin tingle, and the ground beneath him felt oddly unstable, as though it were shifting in slow, deliberate waves. His gaze darted around, desperate for any sign of Jessica. But there was nothing. Only the towering trees, their branches casting long, twisted shadows in the dim light. He called her name, his voice hoarse and cracked, but there was no response. The silence that followed his shout was deafening. He began walking, stumbling at first, his legs still weak from whatever had happened to him. Every step he took felt heavy, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let him pass. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches reaching down like dark fingers trying to pull him back into the depths of the forest. Matt felt a sudden pull, a cold chill in the air that seemed to draw him forward, deeper into the forest. The darkness ahead grew thicker, swallowing everything in its path, and for a moment he hesitated. But then, through the haze of fear and confusion, he saw it. A small figure, barely visible through the trees. It was Jessica. She stood still, facing away from him, her body rigid, her head tilted unnaturally to the side, as though listening for something. Her hair hung in loose, tangled strands and her clothes were torn, as though she had been through hell. But it was her eyes that made Matt's blood run cold. They were wide, unblinking and blank. The darkness seemed to swirl in them as though something was trapped inside, something ancient and unholy. She was no longer the woman he had known. This thing standing before him was not her. "Jessica?" Matt whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "Please speak to me. What's happening?" There was no answer. Jessica didn't move. She simply stood there, frozen in place, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond her. Matt took a cautious step forward. His heart thudded in his chest, every instinct telling him to turn and run, but he couldn't leave her like this. He had to help her. He had to save her. He reached out to touch her arm, but as soon as his fingers made contact with her skin, a sharp, bone-chilling scream ripped through the air, so loud and so raw that it felt as though it was tearing the forest apart. Matt recoiled, his heart racing, and before he could even comprehend what was happening, Jessica's head snapped to the side, her mouth opening impossibly wide. Her scream escalated into something primal, something that didn't belong to her. From within the darkened depths of the forest, a shadow began to emerge, tall and thin, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. It moved with an eerie, jerking motion, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings, dragging itself toward Matt. The creature's face was covered in darkness, its eyes glowing a dull, malevolent red as it fixed its gaze on him. Matt's body froze. His legs were leaden, as if the very air around him had become thick and suffocating. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. And then it spoke. "Leave this place." The voice was a raspy whisper, as if the words were scraped from the deepest part of the earth, distorted and ancient. It echoed in Matt's mind, reverberating through the very fabric of reality itself. He tried to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The forest seemed to close in, the trees creaking and groaning like they were alive, watching him. "Leave her," the voice continued, its words dripping with venom. "She is ours now. She belongs to the darkness." The creature moved closer, its limbs creaking and snapping as though they were never meant to bend in such ways. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping until Matt could see his breath hanging in the air, visible and trembling. He tried to fight it, tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. It was like the forest itself was holding him in place, pinning him to the ground with an invisible force. Jessica's body twitched, her head turning to face him. Her lips parted, and for a split second, Matt thought he saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But it was fleeting, swallowed by the blackness that had taken hold of her. Her body jerked violently, as though something inside her was fighting to break free. Matt could feel the pull of the darkness, tugging at him, dragging him deeper into the forest. He was paralyzed, unable to escape, his gaze locked on Jessica. She was no longer the woman he had known. She was something else, something worse. The creature stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. It seemed to grow larger, its form stretching upward, until it towered above him. The red glow of its eyes filled Matt's vision, and for a moment he thought he saw the shape of something else in the darkness, an ancient, twisted being, something that had existed long before the forest itself. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything went black. Matt's world dissolved into darkness. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and he could hear the faint whispers of something far away, calling to him, pulling at his mind. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, his body stiff. The darkness surrounded him, pressing in from all sides, suffocating him. He could hear whispers, soft and faint at first, like distant voices. They grew louder with each passing moment, their words unintelligible, just beyond his reach. Panic surged through him as he realized he was no longer in the forest. He was somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. The whispers grew clearer. Leave. Leave this place. The voice, distorted and haunting, echoed in his mind. He tried to call out, but no sound escaped his lips. It felt as though his very soul was trapped in this void, this endless darkness. "Matt, you shouldn't have come." The voice came again, this time closer. He could feel the breath of something on his skin, its presence looming over him. The darkness seemed to twist and shift, and for a brief moment Matt saw a shape, a figure in the distance, barely visible, standing in the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Matt's heart raced. The whispers continued, growing louder, more frantic. They pressed in on him from all sides, their words now sharp, commanding. "You are not welcome here. You cannot leave." He tried to scream, but no sound left his mouth. His body was paralyzed, trapped in the suffocating darkness. And then, suddenly, a blinding light filled the void, washing over him, piercing the shadows. The light was so bright that Matt could hardly bear to look at it. His eyes burned, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure, a person, standing in the light. But when the light faded, the forest was gone. The darkness was gone. And Matt was left alone, stranded in the silence of the unknown. Part 6. The Dark Truth. Matt's eyes snapped open, the bright light from his vision slowly fading, replaced by the thick, oppressive darkness of the forest. His heart raced, and he found himself gasping for breath as if he had been underwater, struggling for air. His body felt as if it had been bound in chains, every movement sluggish and stiff. The silence around him was maddening, broken only by the soft, distant rustling of leaves, as though something, or someone, was moving just out of his sight. For a long moment he couldn't understand what had happened. Was it a dream? A hallucination? He had been trapped in the darkness, surrounded by the whispers, but now he was back in the forest, standing amidst the towering trees, the air damp with the smell of moss and decay. And there it was again, that pull, that haunting sensation that had first led him deeper into the forest, pulling at his soul, urging him toward something he couldn't comprehend. His legs felt heavy, but despite every instinct screaming for him to run, he took a step forward. He heard it then, the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush, almost in rhythm with his own heartbeat. It was the same slow cadence, the same pulse that had haunted him before, and it was coming closer. His eyes darted around, but all he could see were the dark shadows of the trees, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like the hands of the dead. The whispering had stopped, but there was something worse now, something more dangerous lurking in the silence. Suddenly, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was faint at first, just a silhouette against the dim light, but then it became clearer. A figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with long limbs that stretched in ways that shouldn't be possible. The figure moved with jerky, unnatural steps, its head tilted at an impossible angle, as if it had no regard for the natural laws of the human body. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but Matt could feel its presence, its eyes boring into him, burning through the veil of night. He froze. His legs felt like stone, unable to move as the figure crept closer. The air around him felt thick, suffocating, as though the very forest itself was closing in, trapping him in its depths. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, the figure stopped just inches away from him. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The air was heavy with 1,000 unspoken words, each one dripping with malice and intent. The figure's mouth opened, but it wasn't a mouth he recognized. It was gaping, twisted, its teeth sharp and jagged like something from a nightmare. In the next instant, the whispers returned, louder than before, echoing in Matt's mind, drowning out all coherent thought. "You cannot escape." The voice was low, guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It filled Matt's head, slithering into his ears, crawling through his veins, until he could feel the words in his very bones. "This forest is not yours. You are a trespasser, and you will never leave." Matt's breath quickened, panic flooding through his veins as his limbs began to tremble. The thing in front of him reached out, its fingers long and twisted, its skin slick and shiny like the bark of the trees. Slowly it touched his arm, the coldness of its touch sending an icy jolt through his body. "You belong here now." Before Matt could even process the words, the figure's grip tightened. The darkness around him deepened, swallowing him whole, and suddenly he felt himself being dragged, pulled into the ground. His feet left the forest floor, his body weightless, as though the earth itself had decided to claim him. His vision blurred, and in the span of a second the forest shifted. He was no longer standing in the clearing. He was falling into the depths of the earth, the sound of his screams drowned by the howling wind, the darkness pressing in from every side. Matt struggled, his hands flailing, trying to break free of whatever invisible force was holding him. But the more he fought, the deeper the darkness seemed to pull. He felt as though he were sinking into something ancient, something that had waited for centuries, lying dormant beneath the earth. "You will become one of us," the voice whispered again, the words wrapping around him like chains, binding him to whatever ancient entity lurked beneath the surface. Matt's mind raced, his heart pounding as he tried to find a way out, but the forest had him now. The darkness was everywhere. It was in his thoughts, in his blood, in the very air he breathed. No one leaves the woods, not once you've been chosen. With that final chilling sentence, Matt's mind shattered, his thoughts no longer his own. The weight of the forest, of the entity that resided within it, consumed him, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was the twisted face of the creature, its eyes glowing with that sickly red light. Matt woke to the sound of his own ragged breath, his body drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. But he was no longer in the forest. He was back in the cabin, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath him, the soft glow of the fire in the corner. But everything felt wrong. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. It wasn't the same place, not anymore. The darkness had followed him. The creature, the whispers, they had all followed him back from the forest. And in the silence of the cabin, he realized the truth. He was never meant to leave. He had become a part of the forest, a part of whatever evil had been waiting there all along. The whispers returned, soft at first, then growing louder with each passing second, until it felt as though they were coming from inside his own mind. "You belong to us now. Forever." And as Matt stood, his legs unsteady, he felt the weight of the forest close in around him once more. The darkness, the thing that had taken Jessica, had come for him. There was no escaping it. The forest had claimed him. And it would never let him go. Part 7, the final embrace. Matt stood in the middle of the cabin, the whispers swirling in his head like a hurricane of dread. The air around him grew colder, and he could feel the temperature dropping, as if the very walls of the cabin were being swallowed by the shadows that had followed him back from the forest. The fire in the corner of the room sputtered, its warmth flickering and dimming, as if it too were succumbing to the chilling presence that filled the space. He stumbled toward the window, his feet dragging across the wooden floor as if they had become heavy with the weight of something unseen. The darkness outside was no longer just a shadow. It had become a living, breathing entity pressing against the glass, waiting for him. He could see the trees in the distance, their twisted branches swaying even though there was no wind. The forest was alive, watching him, its gaze unblinking, unyielding. Matt's heart pounded in his chest as he turned away from the window. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was no place to go. The forest had followed him. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own home, in his own mind. The door creaked open behind him and he froze. He hadn't opened it. No one had come in. But there it was, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, each step like a hammer against his skull. He turned, and there it was again, the figure. The same tall, thin shape that had haunted him before, standing in the doorway of the cabin, its eyes glowing like fire, its mouth stretching into a twisted grin. "You can't run," it whispered, its voice like a growl, a promise of something far worse. "You've already been chosen." Matt backed away, his mind reeling. He didn't know what to do. What could he do? He had no weapons, no way to fight this thing. All he had was his fear, his desperation, but they wouldn't save him. "You'll never leave. Not alive. Not in this world," the figure hissed, taking a step closer. With every movement it seemed to grow, becoming larger, more monstrous, as though it was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every breath he took. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath him warping and shifting, as if the very structure of the house was alive, bending to the will of the forest. Matt's breathing became shallow, his chest tight, his thoughts spinning. He had to fight. He had to escape. But where? There was no escape. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping, their words becoming a cacophony of madness. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The figure in the doorway was growing, its eyes widening, its hands stretching toward him, like claws reaching out to claim him. "It's over," it whispered, its voice almost tender now. "The forest has claimed you, Matt. You are ours." Matt's body shook violently, his limbs no longer obeying him. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an unbearable cold. He could feel the darkness closing in, enveloping him, wrapping around him like chains, pulling him deeper into the abyss. But then, in the midst of his terror, something inside him snapped. Something primal, something deep within his soul, rose to the surface. The fear, the desperation, it had all led him here, but it was no longer enough to hold him back. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. He reached out, his hand trembling but with an urgency that he didn't fully understand. He grabbed a nearby chair, lifting it above his head, and swung it with all the strength he had left. The figure staggered back, its eyes flashing with surprise, but it didn't falter. It didn't stop. "You think you can fight us?" It snarled, its voice becoming deeper, more guttural. "You are nothing but prey." Matt didn't care. He swung again, the chair splintering as it hit the figure, but the creature didn't bleed. It didn't even seem to feel pain. It just kept coming, its twisted limbs reaching for him, its mouth opening wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that dripped with something black and viscous. Matt felt himself being pulled toward the figure, his body moving against his will, as if the very ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. He struggled, kicking, fighting, but it was no use. The darkness had him now. There was no escape, but just as he thought it was over, just as the cold darkness of the forest seemed to swallow him whole, a strange feeling washed over him. A pulse, a light, a distant warmth. For the briefest moment, it felt like he was being pulled away from the figure, away from the darkness, back into the light. His eyes snapped open, and he found himself standing in the middle of the cabin, the door shut, the figure gone. The fire was roaring in the corner, its warmth chasing away the chill that had consumed him moments before. The forest outside was silent once more, the oppressive feeling lifted. But as Matt stood there, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, he knew one thing for certain. The forest wasn't done with him. It was still out there, watching, waiting for him to slip. And this time it wasn't going to let him go so easily. The end, or is it? As Matt left the cabin behind, he knew that the forest would always be a part of him. The darkness, the whispers, it would follow him wherever he went. The forest had claimed him, but not in the way he had imagined. It had left its mark on him, a scar deep within his soul. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, the forest would always be there, waiting. The whispers would always call, and the darkness would always chase. And in the end, Matt knew that no one ever truly leaves the forest, not once it has marked you. The forest keeps its secrets and it never lets go. The final reckoning. A reflection on Matt's journey. Matt's journey was one of both literal and metaphorical survival. It began as an escape from the overwhelming stress of city life, a desire for solitude, peace, and the freedom that came with off-grid living. But what Matt discovered in the woods, in the isolation of his cabin, was something far darker than he could have ever imagined. What was supposed to be a simple, fulfilling life in nature turned into a fight for survival, against forces far more powerful than he could understand. From the very moment he arrived at the cabin, something felt wrong. The eerie silence that enveloped the forest was oppressive, a strange feeling of being watched constantly lurking in the air. The woods seemed to have a life of their own, a presence that Matt couldn't quite place but couldn't ignore. The very trees themselves felt like they were part of the landscape, not just trees, but sentinels watching over him. Every step he took seemed to be scrutinized by an unseen force, every sound amplified, turning the peaceful environment into an unsettling trap. As time passed, small details began to add up. The odd, deliberate noises outside the cabin at night, the strange figure that seemed to appear in the corner of his vision, the unsettling feeling that he was not truly alone in those woods. And then the figure in the doorway, an unearthly creature with glowing eyes, its voice a growl sending waves of terror crashing through Matt's mind. It was no longer just a place of solitude. It had become a nightmare, a personal hell that had come to claim him. What made Matt's situation even more terrifying was the way the forest seemed to morph and change, drawing him deeper into its grip. The silence that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. The trees that once stood as majestic symbols of nature now felt like ominous shadows closing in on him. Every step he took, every decision he made, felt like it brought him closer to the very thing he was running from. And when he thought he might escape, that it was over, the forest showed him that there was no escape. It had marked him. And no matter how far he ran, it would follow. As the story unfolded, Matt's struggle wasn't just against the supernatural force lurking in the woods. It was a battle against his own mind. The whispers, the feeling of being watched, the paranoia, all of these were reflections of his growing fear. The forest didn't need to physically trap him. It did so by trapping his thoughts, by consuming him from within. And in a way, that was the real horror of the story. How fear and isolation could change a person, turning them into something unrecognizable, something vulnerable and broken. At the climax of his ordeal, Matt fought back against the figure, against the entity that had been haunting him. But even in his desperation, even as he wielded a chair to defend himself, he realized that it wasn't just about fighting something physical. The forest, the whispers, the figure, they represented the overwhelming weight of his fear, the parts of him that he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. His true battle was not against the creatures of the night, but against the fear that had taken root deep inside him. But what happened next, the way the figure disappeared, the way the darkness receded for just a moment, was a false victory. The relief was short-lived, and in the end the forest had left its mark. It hadn't claimed his body, but it had claimed something deeper. His peace, his sense of security, his understanding of the world. Matt could never return to the cabin without knowing that he wasn't alone. The whispers would always follow. The forest would always be watching. Matt's journey is a powerful metaphor for the way fear can control us, how it can creep into every corner of our lives and consume us, even when we are physically safe. The wilderness, the isolation, the horror, it is all a reflection of the internal battles we face. We think we are running from something outside ourselves, but in reality, the real danger lies within. It's the fear of the unknown, the fear of the dark corners of our minds, the fear of confronting the very things we try to escape. And just like Matt, we are often forced to face these fears head-on, often in the most terrifying ways. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Matt's story? Do you believe the forest was just a physical place, or was it a representation of something deeper? What lessons have you taken from his experience, and how can we apply them to our own lives? Please leave your comments below. Share your thoughts with the community, and let's have a discussion about the fears that we all face and how we can overcome them. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a chilling tale like this one. Your support means everything to us, and it keeps us motivated to bring more thrilling content straight to you.